over to the book of 2 Samuel chapter 16. 2 Samuel chapter 16. I hope y'all don't get mad at me this morning because we're going to preach on anger. 2 Samuel chapter 17. Now, we have looked over the past little bit about what the roots of problems are in folks' lives. You know, we've looked at emotional trauma and fear and guilt and grief and insecurity and resentment and rejection and shame. And you know, anger comes out of a lot of those things. And some people try to turn over a new leaf with anger, but because what's underneath it doesn't get dealt with, sometimes they still keep dealing with anger. And until we deal with those things in our hearts that affect us, we still have a problem with these things because that's dealing with symptoms. Now, anger is one of the symptoms that comes out of that. And we're going to look at possibly one of the angriest men in the Bible. Now, as we look at this, David is in a difficult circumstance here. Absalom, his son, who was really a wicked man in a lot of ways, but there was a lot of underlying things besides that. Absalom has taken the throne. Absalom is taken the throne here, proclaimed himself king. David is forced to flee. And like normally happens, if you've ever noticed, when something goes bad, other things go bad. Have you ever noticed that? That's not just me. Sometimes when things happen, you have other things kind of pile on. And David is going down the road, and this is what he's confronted with. Verse 5 says this, and when King David came to Bahurim, behold, thence came out a man of the family of the house of Saul, whose name was Shimei, the son of Gera. He came forth and cursed still as he came. And he cast stones at David and all the servants of King David and all the people and all the mighty men that were on his right hand and on his left. Maybe this is just me, but this doesn't seem like this is such a smart idea when you look at it. And thus said Shimei when he cursed, Come out, thou bloody man, and thou man of Belial. The Lord hath returned upon thee all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose stead thou hast reigned. And the Lord hath delivered the kingdom into the hand of Absalom my son. And behold, thou art taken in thy mischief, because thou art a bloody man. Then said Abishai the son of Zeruiah unto the king, Why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me, I go over, I pray thee, and take off his head. And the king said, What have I to do with you, ye sons of Zeruiah? So let him curse, because the Lord has said unto him, Curse David. Who shall then say, Wherefore hast thou done so? And David said to Abishai and all his servants, Behold, my son which came forth out of my bowels seeketh my life. How much more now may this Benjamite do it? Let him alone and let him curse, for the Lord hath bidden him. Maybe the Lord will look on mine affliction, that the Lord will requite me good for his cursing this day. And as David and his men went by the way, Shimei went along the hillside over against him, and cursed as he went, threw stones at him, and cast dust. And the king and all the people that were with him came weary and refreshed themselves there. Let's go before the Lord in prayer. Lord, I pray you just have your hand with us today. Help us to always have a good attitude towards other people. And Lord, I pray you just have your hand and have your help today. Pray you encourage our hearts, have your hand in your working today. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Anger is generally something that backfires on. While a man was checking his bags at the airport, he just became indignant and just angry and mad at the employee who was handling the luggage there at the curb. For several minutes, he belittled the young man and just criticized his every move. And you know, surprisingly, that curbside porter really didn't seem troubled by this man's verbal abuse. And he just kept letting him cussed him out one side and down the other. And after the angry man entered the airport, a woman who'd watched the whole thing, walked up to the luggage handler and asked, well, how do you put up with such anger and such injustice? The young man said, it's easy. That guy's going to New York, but I'm sending his bags to Brazil. Generally, anger backfires on a person. Now, I think we ought to realize here, too, that there's one person that's the subject of anger there is David, and there's one man that's angry, but when we look at anger, does anger really ever help a situation? I mean, there are some times when there should be righteous anger at what's happening. But most of the time, if we're to be honest, anger is a reaction, not the cause. While there's those that have a tendency to be angry, most of the time there's going to be an underlying cause. And you can have righteous anger. We're going to look at that later. But most, just being frankly, most of it has something that has a root to it. Those things that we looked at, trauma, fear, guilt, grief, all of those things bring that out. Resentment or bitterness, rejection. Sometimes those things just bring that anger to a forefront. Now, with this man here, there's probably several things that are behind it. Number one, he's probably been through some emotional trauma and some grief. Look at verse 5. And when David came to Bahrain, behold, thence came out a man of the family of the house of Saul. Saul and 3 of his sons died at once. Now, that's got to be traumatic. That's got to be awful. I was researching a little bit going back, and I guess I had a great uncle or a great uncle that back in 1920s was pulling a car onto a ferry, and the car got away, and it was like 2, 3 of the family members drowned. I mean, when you've got a mass tragedy like that, now tragedy and grief leaves a footprint in us. And many times people will respond at one point or another during the grieving process with anger. That's trauma. He's dealing with that. Now, we don't know exactly how directly he's related, but this has been something that's happened. There's been others that have died in that house. And he's dealing with grief there. He's also dealing with bitterness. Look at verse 8. The Lord hath returned upon thee all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose stead thou hast reigned. And the Lord hath delivered the kingdom into the hand of Absalom my son. And behold, thou art taken in thy mischief, because thou art a bloody man. I think, would you think maybe he's just a little bit bitter against David? More than a little bit, he's really bitter. He's really angry. Now, really, that's not deserved. There's that problem. There's probably a little bit of guilt in there. Guilt a lot of times comes from anger, and they go together. They're kind of opposite forces, but people dealing with guilt often feel like I'm bad and need to aggressively defend themselves with anger. You see that. Guilt comes after anger too, by the way. Those things are linked together. There are other times when grief, when the two go together, rejection. God had rejected Saul and the family of Saul, so there's got to be some of that in there. Now, regardless of which is the root cause, and there's several things right here, we have to find out what the cause is. When we're dealing with sin repeatedly, rather anger or something else, there's something behind it that has us doing what we're doing. Now, I'll tell you, it's easy to be angry in life. But anger is often misplaced. Now, who is he angry with? David. Should he be angry with David? Well, let's look. Verse 6. And he cast stone stones at David and all the servants of King David. Now, what do they got to do with it? He's throwing stones at them, and all the people and the mighty men were on his right hand and on his left. And thus said Shimei when he cursed, come out, thou bloody man, and thou man of Belial. The Lord hath returned upon thee all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose stead thou hast reigned. And the Lord hath delivered the kingdom into the hand of Absalom my son. And behold, thou art taken in thy mischief, because thou art a bloody man. He's king. He's a bloody man. He calls him a man of Belial. That means worthless or good for nothing. And he's angry for the house of Saul in which she's reigned. And it's clear that he blames David for the death of Saul, but is David responsible? Now, I won't have you turn back there, but 1 Samuel chapter 31, going into 2 Samuel, kind of gives the story of what happens there. It was not David who killed Saul. It was the Philistines. 1 Samuel 31 says this, and the Philistines followed hard upon Saul and upon his sons, and the Philistines slew Jonathan and Abinadab and Maleshu, Saul's son. All three of Saul's sons are killed, and they're chasing after Saul, and flip to the lapel, please. And they're trying to get him. You get into 2 Samuel chapter 1, it says this, and the battle went sore against Saul, and the archers hit him. Who got him first? It was an archer. Who was it that was from? They were the Philistines. Did David have anything to do with this? No. Who killed Saul's sons? The Philistines. Who shoots Saul with an arrow? A Philistine. The battle went sore against Saul, and the archers hit him, and he was sore wounded of the archers. Then said Saul unto his armor-bearer, draw thy sword and thrust me through therewith, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and abuse me. But his armor-bearer would not, for he was sore afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and fell upon it. And when his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he fell likewise upon his sword and died with him. Matter of fact, later on, when one comes bearing news that Saul is dead and claims he came upon Saul and he's an Amalekite, and he comes and he tells David, you know, I came upon him and he was dying, I'm sure he wouldn't have survived, so I killed him. Whether or not he did that or not, David's got nothing to do with it. When David hears that story, whether or not this is true or not, David has him executed for killing the king. So David mourns for Saul. Is this the actions that he should be blamed for? No. David didn't have anything to do with it. Verse 17, David lamented with his lamentation over Saul and over Jonathan his son. And there's war between David's house and the house of Saul with Ishbosheth. And Ishbosheth is killed by Rechab and Baanah. But when they come into David and say, we killed your enemy, what does David do? He has them killed for their murder. David's not the bad guy here. Matter of fact, twice, when Saul was the one that was coming after David trying to kill him, he is delivered right into his hands, and David could have killed him easily. But David doesn't. So do you think Shimei's anger is a little bit misplaced? Now, I know there's a little bit of possibility there. He has to hand over some of the sons of Saul that were apparently responsible for a massacre there to the Gibeonites. But God says it's that. See, the problem was he's blaming the wrong person. Instead of the Philistines, he's blaming David. Now, is a lot of our anger out in this world misdirected? Go talk to a waitress at a restaurant. You'll hear a lot of things. Well, we've been witnessing to a few, and I tell you, you hear these stories. I tell you what, somebody gets the order wrong, and guess who gets to hear it? That waitress. Somebody gets their order wrong at McDonald's. That person at the cashier didn't fix that thing. It was the people in the back. But guess who gets the heat? That person there. A lot of times people just get angry and they throw their anger not at the one that's responsible, but at somebody else that becomes a target. Much anger is directed wrong in the wrong direction. You know, sometimes it's somebody that we really can't do anything about, and we just kind of aim it at Fluffy when we get home. Boss gets us mad, so Fluffy gets it. It's directed, but you know what? I think the greatest area of anger that is misdirected is people that are angry at God. And that's what's going on here too. Probably more anger in the world is aimed at God and hits man instead. People cannot get directly at God, so they attack a Christian, so they get mad at somebody. Jesus said in John chapter 15, verse 18, if the world hate you, you know that it hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love his own, but because you're not of the world, but I have chosen you out of the world, therefore the world hateth you. Do you want to know why we're vilified in the news media? It's not because we're fundamentalists, it's because we're associated with God. And there's a lot of people today that hate God, whether they want to recognize he exists or not. God rejected Saul. Shimei has a problem with what God did. 1 Samuel chapter 15, and Samuel said unto Saul, I will not return with thee, for thou hast rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord hath rejected thee from being king over Israel. And as Samuel turned about to go away, he laid hold upon the skirt of his mantle, and it ran. And Samuel said unto him, the Lord hath rent the kingdom of Israel from thee this day, and hath given it unto a neighbor of thine that is better than you. If God removed Saul as king and anointed David in his stead, Shimei has a problem with God. You know, there's a lot of people out there in this world that are angry with God. And you know, sometimes we can be angry with God too. When something happens that we don't expect or doesn't turn out the way to which we want to, it's sometimes easy to get angry with God. Many times we redirect that to somebody else, and that anger just keeps bubbling up. Until we get that right with God, it's going to keep happening. I think it's important to note here, it's often misplaced, but it's often just not rational. Look at verse 6. Now I want for you to get the picture up here. You've got a guy up on a ridge, armed with rocks. Down on the road down there, you've got a bunch of guys armed with swords, with spears, with bows, with arrows, and a whole lot of armor and shields and everything else. Against a guy, one guy versus a whole bunch of men down there, one guy up here with rocks versus a bunch of guys down there with swords. So when we look at this, look at verse 6. And he cast stones at David, and all the servants of King David, and all the people, and his mighty men were on his right hand and on his left. Maybe it's just me, but I don't think this is too smart. That just doesn't make any sense, does it? Here is one man up here, armed with a few rocks, taking on an army. He has no choice. This is just dumb. I don't know whether he wanted to be a martyr or whatever he wanted, but this isn't rational. This isn't a smart idea. And you know what? When people get in the heat of anger, a lot of times they don't think about their actions. They don't think about what they're saying. They don't think about who they're going to hurt with what they're saying. They don't think about their actions and what's going to be the result of their actions and what could happen. How many people have been fired because getting angry over the boss, getting angry at the boss? In the heat of anger, people don't think about it. And anger often begets anger. Look at verse 9. Then said Abishai the son of Zeruiah unto the king, Why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over, I pray thee, and take off his head. Well, that ought to quiet him down. And the king said, What have I to do with you, your sons of Zeruiah? So let him curse, because the Lord has said in him, Curse David, who shall then say, Wherefore hast thou done so? Anger begets anger. And when we get angry, we don't get rational. We do things that just don't make sense. But you know, when we look at all this, anger often comes with regret. Look, just go over a couple pages. Go over to 2 Samuel in chapter 19. Absalom's killed. David actually mourns that. I think that shows David's character. Even though David would fail God, yes, he's done that before. David's character still says when Absalom is killed, he mourns for Absalom, even though Absalom was his enemy and trying to kill him. But Shimei, as David heads back into there, is forced to kind of eat his words. I don't know what he's hoping for, hoping that Saul's going to be with, hoping some of the family of Saul or something's restored. And wrath and he gets in there. There's going to be regret when it comes to wrath, when it comes to anger. Shimei has to eat his words. Look at verse 18 there in chapter 19. And there went over a ferry boat to carry over the king's household and do what he thought good. And Shimei the son of Geruah fell down before the king as he was come over Jordan. As he comes over Jordan, the boat comes over there, and he is the first one to go out and meet David. Why? Because he knows what could happen now. He's afraid. His anger has put him in a position that has endangered his life. And you know, honestly, most kings would have done that. Now, I think David later on gets a little bit bitter over the incident. But when we see that, he's afraid of what his anger has caused. He's the first one to meet him. Verse 19. And he said to the king, Let not my lord impute iniquity unto me. Neither do thou remember what thy servant did perversely in the day my lord the king went out of Jerusalem, that the king should take it to his heart. Please don't take it to heart. I was a moron. It comes with regret. Verse 20. For thy servant doth know that I have sinned. I tell you what, dealing with anger, you got to realize you're sinning. Now, I wonder how much of this here is just he's afraid of what's going to happen. Therefore, behold, I am come the first this day of all the house of Joseph to go down and meet my Lord the king. I don't know if he's truly sorry or not. He's the first one there. I think that does say a little bit about him. We have to mend things when we get angry. That's something we need to do. But sometimes people will not forget. I think David, to pretty much most extent, now I think maybe at the end of his life when he passes off instructions to Solomon, kind of give some on there to keep an eye on the guy. But Abishai, right at that point, he's back again. Look at verse 21. But Abishai the son of Zeruiah answered and said, Shall not Shimei be put to death for this, because he has cursed the Lord's anointed? And David said, What have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah, that you should be this day be adversaries unto me? Shall any man be put to death this day in Israel? For do not I know that I am this day king over Israel? Some people won't forgive. But David does. Look at verse 23. Therefore the king said unto Shimei, thou shalt not die. And the king sware unto him. I tell you what, when we're the subject of anger, forgive. That's the best thing in the world to do, to forgive it. Sometimes we don't realize what that person is going through, and sometimes we don't see that. And don't react in kind to what's done. Even though David had that opportunity to be angry, he didn't react in that way. What if we're the subject? We ought to learn something from David in all this. Thou shalt not die, and the king sware unto him. Forgive. Let the Lord handle it. Going back to where we started there, and the king said, what have I to do with these sons of Israel? So let him curse, because the Lord has said unto him, curse David. Who shall then say, wherefore hast thou done so? And David said to Abishai and all my servants, behold, my son which came forth out of my bowels seeketh my life. How much more now shall this Benjamite do it? Let him alone and let him curse, for the Lord hath visited him. Maybe the Lord will look on my affliction, and the Lord will requite me good for his cursing this day. Forgive it and let the Lord handle it. Sometimes that's the best thing in this life. If we don't let the Lord handle things, we can get bitter for what goes on in this life. We can get angry ourselves for what's going on there. David knows he is not perfect, and he allows the situation, even though he has the means in his hand to wipe that man off the face of the earth, he does not. He forgives. And later on, he forgives. Don't react in kind. He just went on their way. Even though David had reason to be angry, he didn't react that, because it would just provoke that. What if he killed him? That would have made things even worse. How do we deal with that? How do we take care of it? Is there right anger? Yes, there is. You know what? The Bible says in Psalms chapter 7, verse 11, God judges the righteous, and God is angry with the wicked every day. Is God unrighteous to be angry? No, He's not. There is cause. There are times when we need to be angry and use that in the right direction. There are times when we need to do that. When somebody is trying to harm somebody else, we ought to react in anger and help the situation. There are times when does that. But it should be right anger. Jesus in Mark chapter 3, and they watched him rather he would heal him on the Sabbath day, that they might accuse him. And he said unto the man which is the withered hand, stand forth. And when he looked round about on them with anger, being grieved for the hardness of their hearts, and saith unto the man, stretch forth thine hand. He stretched it out, and his hand was restored as the other. There are things that ought to give us righteous indignation. There are things that ought to make us step back and go, this is wrong. But let's be honest. Are most of the things that we get angry about those things? No. Most of the time it's not. There are things out there that ought to make us righteously indignant. Ephesians chapter 6 says, for we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. But that battle is fought not with fists, but with prayer. The rest of that verse says, just later on in that chapter, says, take the helmet of salvation, the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God, praying always with all prayer and supplication in the Spirit, watching thereunto with all perseverance and supplication of the saints. But let's be honest, most anger that happens out there doesn't fit into that category. To be angry at sin, to be angry at things that are wrong. Most men are not getting angry because of the perverts and the wickedness in our society and the evil that's being perpetrated, but because Mr. Johnson's dog did something in our yard. Most of the time we get angry about little piddly stuff. Something somebody did that we don't like. James chapter 1 says this, "Wherefore, my beloved brother, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. For the wrath of man worketh not the righteousness of God." That's the kind of anger generally we deal with. We need to find out what is that source of anger. So many times people become angry at someone other than the source of what their trauma or what the problem or the pain or the resentment or whatever it is. We need to find out. Sometimes it's somebody that we can't even get mad at that's the source of that. And whatever is going on there, it may be a person, it may be an event, it may be both. It may not be the person that we just get mad and angry at, but it's something that reminds us of what's went on in the past. Until we deal with the past, we won't deal with today or the future. We have to get that thing that's in us and turn and repent from that and ask God's forgiveness and ask God to help us where the problem is. Psalm 139 verse 23 and 24 says this, "Search me, O God." He asks to find what it is. Search Him and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there be any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. Until we deal with the source, until we ask God to help us to find what is the source of my anger, we're not going to deal with it. We've got to find the root of the issue. And that anger should not be without a cause. Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, "But I say unto you that whosoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment, and whosoever shall say to his brother, Raca, shall be in danger of the council. Who shall ever say, thou fool, shall be in danger of hellfire." He takes it serious. And you're not going to lose your salvation over anger. It's not what that's talking about. But I tell you, when we look at it, how many times does anger lead to worse and get worse? Even with a cause, I tell you what, it's sure a whole lot better to just forgive and move on. We need to let God handle those situations that we feel are unjust. And let's be honest, there's a whole lot of things in this world that we can't fix. We can't handle it. We can't deal with it. Can we deal with Washington and the mess there? We don't have control over that, do we? We've got to vote. We've got to work. We can write our congressman. We can call our congressman. But we can't really do a whole lot beyond that. God has to deal with a lot. And that's just one example. But I tell you, we have to let God deal with a lot of our problems that we try to fix them the wrong way. Psalm 37, verse 7 and 8 says, "Rest in the Lord and wait patiently for Him. Fret not thyself because of him which prospereth in his way, because of the man that bringeth wicked devices to pass." I tell you what, that wicked old congressman has made all this money off this, and it just makes me mad. It makes me angry. It makes me, and I just, don't fret yourself because of that. Cease from anger and forsake wrath. Fret not thyself in any wise. God deals with situations that we can't. God is far better at dealing with them than what we are. Romans chapter 12, verse 19, "Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath. For it is written, Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord." God's the one in control. He's the one who can take care of the situations that we can't handle, that we can't deal with. When we feel ourselves getting angry, step back, calm ourselves. We need to hear the whole matter. Proverbs chapter 14, verse 17, "He that is soon angry dealeth foolishly, and a man of wicked devices is hated." why James says in James chapter 1, wherefore, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. When we step back from the situation, we don't get a hair-trigger anger and listen the whole thing out, we may find out a lot more. Even if we're on the other end and we hear this anger coming, it's like, well, I'm wondering, can I help you with this? A soft answer turneth away wrath, by the way, folks. Proverbs chapter 29, verse 22. An angry man stirreth up strife, and a furious man aboundeth in transgression. Don't let those things come out. To become angry makes the problem worse. He that is slow to wrath is of great understanding, but he that is hasty of spirit exalteth folly. Proverbs 14:29. Step back. And when we get angry, take care of it quickly. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 26. Be ye angry and sin not. Let not the sun go down upon your wrath. The worst thing we can do is let anger sever. On the couch, mad at the wife. Isn't that true? When we let anger simmer, when we let that anger build up from day to day to day to day, it gets worse because it builds. Deal with it that day. Let not the sun go down upon your wrath. When we deal with that anger, when we get it right that day, it doesn't fester, it doesn't get worse, it doesn't keep getting more angry and turn into wrath and get worse. We deal with it when we shouldn't. We apologize for it. We take care of it. And I'll tell you what, even if we're on the receiving end, sometimes it's best to go up. Us guys don't like to do that. Honey, if I did anything, I'm sorry. When we come up, now that's just an illustration, but I tell you what, sometimes that goes for a lot of the people. Listen, I did anything to make you mad. I'm apologize. And then a lot of times that starts that conversation. It gets that relationship right. Whatever it may be. A co-worker or somebody that we know or a neighbor or like that. Listen, I want to get this right. If we don't, it's going to tear at us perpetually. There's a curse that's laid upon an entire nation because of this in Amos. Thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Edom, and for 4 I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because he did pursue his brother with the sword, and cast off all pity, and his anger did tear perpetually, and he kept his wrath forever. It became so bad that it became a national problem. And I tell you today, folks, anger is a national problem. Before COVID, 89% in a survey said that anger was far worse than a generation ago. Anger is a national problem. But I tell you what, above all, rather if we're on the offending end or the receiving end, forgive. How do we lay aside it? Ephesians chapter 4 says this, verse, let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking. Where's all that come from anger? Be put away from you with all malice. So how do you do that? And be ye kind to one another. Tender-hearted. Rather than being angry, have a tender heart. Forgiving one another, even as God, for Christ's sake, hath forgiven you. That guy got angry at it. Should I forgive him? Did Christ forgive you? Yeah. Then forgive them. I tell you what, as we look at our world, we live in an angry world, and we could use a lot of people that would be reconcilers. We need that today. How much? Over in Colossians it says, but now put off all these, anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy, filthy communication out of your mouth. This echoes what's over in Ephesians. Put on, therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, bowels of mercies. What's the counterpoint to an angry world? A caring heart. Kindness, humbleness of mind, meekness, long-suffering, forbearing one another, and forgiving one another. If any man have a quarrel against any, even as Christ forgave you, so also do ye. Anger is a problem in our society. And I think it's only getting worse, but only 33% of Americans said anger was a negative emotion. I think that's the problem. But I tell you what, we ought to be different in the world. Yeah, there are things out there that we ought to look at and go, oh, this sin is just so bad. It aggravates me, but we ought to step back and realize the reason why people are the way they are, and the reason why they're angry, and the reason why they hate many times is because they're angry at God, whether they realize it or not, and they need the Lord. Oh, we're in a world that could use some happy people, some joy of the Lord, some care, rather than the anger of the world. Let's be a light in this old world. Let's care for people. Let's go.